Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we are quite delighted to have with us this afternoon Phil Taubman, who's here to talk about a book he co-wrote with his brother Bill, McNamara at War, A New History. Each of the Taubman brothers has considerable expertise about the Cold War, though each came at the era from a different vantage point. Phil as a journalist and his brother as an academic. Phil focused on American politics and foreign policy as a correspondent and editor at the New York Times for nearly 30 years, including stints as chief of both the Washington and Moscow bureaus. He's also the author of 3 books about Cold War history, one on the development of America's space-based surveillance satellites, another on efforts by 5 prominent Cold Warriors later in their lives to abolish nuclear weapons, and a third published 2.5 years ago on the life of former Secretary of State George Shultz. Bill Taubman spent years as a professor of political science at Amherst with a focus on the Soviet Union and has written biographies of Soviet leaders Nikita Khrushchev and Mikhail Gorbachev. Together, the Taubmans have written a really illuminating, nuanced, and fascinating biography of one of the most influential and tragic American figures of the Cold War. Robert McNamara went from running the Ford Motor Company to serving as Secretary of Defense under both Kennedy and Johnson and was the dominant figure in the cabinet as he presided over the escalation of the Vietnam War. Brilliant and driven, known for his mastery of detail, McNamara exuded confidence even as evidence grew of American setbacks in Vietnam. As early as 1965, it was later revealed, McNamara had actually ceased to believe the war could be won militarily, yet he continued to defend America's involvement publicly. In the final year of the Johnson administration, he left to run the World Bank and refused to talk about the Vietnam War for many years. Only in 1995, when he was 78 years old and published a memoir, did McNamara acknowledge publicly that he had been wrong about Vietnam, though even this very belated admission of error did not come with an apology for the war. While much has been written about McNamara, the Taubman brothers, drawing on previously unknown notes, letters, and private diaries, present a fuller story of the psychological and the emotional forces that shaped him. They portray McNamara as indeed a very complicated man, riven by internal contradictions, suppressed emotions, zealous loyalty to the presidents he served, and the Taubmans say a profound inability to understand and to overcome his weaknesses. They write at the start of the book, quote, McNamara's war was not only in Vietnam, he was also at war with himself. So much to unpack there. And guiding the conversation with Phil this afternoon will be Bob Woodward, who himself has lots of experience chronicling how several more recent wars were managed. Bob has covered 10 presidents and shared in 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He's written 23 books, all bestsellers, and he's at work on another book that is a look back at some of his amazing reporting over the years. And in the acknowledgments of their book, the Taubmans thank Bob for providing transcripts of unpublished interviews he conducted with McNamara between 1982 and 2007. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Phil Taubman and Bob Woodward.
Thank you. May I do a little bit longer introduction of you? Uh, just because you are somebody who's crawled off to academic world at Stanford, right, for 17 years. But instead of doing what most uh, academics do, write articles that appear in journals that no one reads, you jump back into the fray doing very serious books on national security. And it is, it was not surprising to me, but as I looked at it in detail, the book you did, Secret Empire, Eisenhower, the CIA, and the Hidden Story of America's Space Espionage, a terrific book. This was done almost 2 decades ago. Is that right?
That's correct.
The partnership, five Cold Warriors in their quest to ban the bomb. You would be surprised who's on that list. Henry Kissinger.
Reluctantly.
George, right. And then your book, The Life and Times of George Shultz, a couple of years ago, by far the best book on George Shultz, who I knew pretty well, but not as well as I did when I finished your book. I mean, it's you really, and you're only 77 years old. You would think,
47, Bob.
you'd be 147 or something like that. And so now you've done McNamara, and I want to hone in on a couple of things that I think are really important, which is McNamara's theory of how you serve and advise presidents at the core of what his job was as Secretary of Defense. How would you summarize what he really felt that job is and how to do it?
So the word I would use is loyalty, and I'll expand on that in a minute. But first, I want to thank a few people, some of whom may be in the audience today. My brother and I benefited greatly from the generosity of fellow authors. And so when we started our project, we were aided by Peter Osnos, a name you may know. He was a longtime Washington Post reporter, went on to become a book publisher. Brian Vandemark, who's a professor at the Naval Academy. The two of them worked very closely with McNamara on McNamara's book, In Retrospect, which was published in 1995. And both Peter and Brian gave us all the transcripts of all the interviews they did with McNamara, some of which didn't get into his book, a lot that didn't get into his book. Paul Hendrickson, another name that may be familiar to you, a longtime Washington Post reporter. Paul did a book about McNamara, and he too gave us all of his notes. And Deborah Shapley, who I believe is here today, welcome, Deborah. Deborah wrote a very fine biography of Robert McNamara, published in 1995. And Deborah, too, also gave us access to her papers. So it's a kind of fellowship of authors. It's a wonderful thing when you benefit from it. So I want to thank them. Of course, I want to thank Politics and Prose for having us here today. And I should say a word about why my brother is not here. He planned to be here, but he had back surgery on Tuesday, so of course he's not in shape to travel. He sends his best and is sorry to miss this. So back to your question. Bob McNamara was interviewed shortly after he gave up the defense job by Life magazine. He was just starting work at the World Bank, 1968. And the author, Brock Bowers, said to him, "Mr. McNamara, why didn't you quit? You came to doubt the war. You concluded, and we later learned in 1965, just months after the big escalatory decisions in Vietnam that made it an American war and wound up with 500,000 American troops going to Vietnam. Within months of that, you came to doubt the war. Why didn't you quit? Why didn't you become a war opponent, join the anti-war movement? And McNamara said, loyalty. I felt I needed to remain loyal to the President of the United States. And Brower said to him, but Mr. McNamara, what about a higher calling when you're serving the President? To which McNamara, having taken the oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, like other cabinet members, said, that's bunk, basically. You'll see the quote in the book. It's bunk. There is nothing more important than remaining loyal to the President of the United States. So his definition of service to Lyndon Johnson was to remain at his side, prosecute the war, even though he doubted it could be won.
Okay, yes. And he even took it further by saying that he did not feel it was his job to try to move the president. Now, isn't that silly and corrupt? I mean, isn't that the job to tell exactly what you think? Okay, maybe it won't be accepted, maybe you're going to have to resign, but how better to inform the president than for the Secretary of Defense, in this case McNamara, actually saying, look, this is where I am on this. You deserve a kind of, to use an old term, bark off view, and that he is failing in his duty by not doing that.
So, you know, he tried to de-escalate the war after he came to this conclusion in '65. And there's an amazing moment in the book. One of the things that we found was an unpublished secret diary that had been kept by his top Vietnam policy aide at the Defense Department, John McNaughton.
Tell him who that was, because it's very important.
John McNaughton, who was nominated to become Navy Secretary. And just weeks before he was to take office as Navy Secretary, John McNaughton and his wife and his younger son were killed in an airplane crash, commercial airplane crash. This diary fell into the hands of his older son, Alex, who turned out to live 30 miles from me in Connecticut. And Alex very graciously gave me a copy of this unpublished diary. And in it, and you'll see in the book, in April 1966, 9 months after he sat at Camp David and in the Oval Office and advised President Johnson that he must escalate the war by sending tens of thousands of American combat troops to Vietnam, Robert McNamara says to John McNaughton confidentially, I want to bring the boys home from Vietnam so bad I can hardly stand it. And
do you believe that? Do you believe that that's true? In other words, I've read the book very carefully, familiar with the history of Vietnam somewhat, and it strikes me that McNamara is not really being straight with lots of people, including himself.
No, you can see it, Bob. It is, I believe it's true. I have no doubt about it, because the McNaughton diary is about 80 pages of typed. His son had it translated from handwriting into a typed version. It's quite extensive, and it is clear throughout the diary that McNamara doubted the war could be won, was eager to try to de-escalate it, but never had the gumption, never had the moxie to go into the Oval Office and say to Lyndon Johnson, we cannot win this war, let's bring the boys home. He never did that.
But that's not just not having the moxie. That is a failure of the core responsibility. isn't it?
Absolutely. We say in the book that Robert McNamara's story is a story of catastrophically failed leadership.
Yes, it is. And the question, not just the psychological component here, is why? Why did this intelligent man, the devotion to service, you can never say he was not devoted to trying to do the job in his way. But this is not just a compelling lapse, but it's a failure to understand his responsibility.
I would say it was certainly a failure to understand his responsibilities, but more than that, and I think this is what our book is really about, it's a failure to understand himself, a failure to understand his personal weaknesses. It's a failure to understand that under that arrogant, self-confident demeanor that he was famous for, he intimidated everyone who worked for him at the Pentagon and earlier at the Ford Motor Company. Underneath that exterior was a man filled with insecurity, a man who doubted himself, a man who could not balance his opposition to the war with his being a proponent of the war. And so it all devolved down to a very simple proposition. Robert McNamara led a double life. And the book describes that. And the reason he led a double life was because of human weaknesses, his own weaknesses. He couldn't figure out how to either, okay, I'm going to support the war, and I'm going to forget my concerns about it, my concerns about the men who were dying by the thousands in Vietnam. I'm going to be a good soldier. I'm going to go ahead with this, and I'm not going to doubt myself. Or he couldn't go in the other direction and say, this war is a mistake. We've got to end it. And so he tried to straddle both worlds. It led to his breaking down, basically, psychologically and emotionally, over the last decades of his life. Robert McNamara was a broken man.
Yeah, but why wouldn't somebody like McNaughton, who was there, say to him, boss, Mr. Secretary, you have shared with me this inner turmoil that is coming out against. Don't you have a response? Why wouldn't there be that push for McNaughton to say, go to the president and lay this out?
Because they equivocated. And there's a chapter in the book called Equivocation, which is all about this period. They equivocated. That you see in the McNaughton diary, they sat around and, for example, McNaughton would come to work and he would say to McNamara, the government of Saigon is such a disaster, and in fact it was. It didn't command the support of the Vietnamese people. And look, let's use that as a pretext to go to the president and tell him, let's get out. Why are we fighting? Why are we losing American lives and spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to support a corrupt government? But they never would summon the will to actually do that. There's an amazing moment at which McNamara and McNaughton see the glimmer of a possible peace negotiation that's being pursued by two Frenchmen who had connections in Hanoi.
And that was real.
That was real, and Henry Kissinger, who was a young assistant professor at Harvard at the time, got involved in that. And McNamara, there's a meeting in the Oval Office, I guess, with Rusk, the Secretary of State, McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, McNamara, and the President. McNamara is the one who says, there's this interesting diplomatic initiative, Mr. President. Let's get behind it. And Rusk says, you're wasting your time, Bob. It's going nowhere. Secretary of State Russ says, you're wasting your time. Forget it. So McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, says to the president, well, with your permission, Mr. President, I'll pursue it. And he tried, but it was thwarted largely because even as he was trying to coax that along, a wider bombing campaign against the North began, which he didn't approve personally, but he approved it officially and gave the orders for it.
Was there a moment in writing this? First, I mean, it's such an important book about management, not just about managing more, where you had this information where you literally had to kind of stop writing and pause and agonize.
That we did.
Yes.
Yeah, well, writing a book can be agony in general. So, you always have to kind of overcome your...
Particularly with your brother.
Yeah, you see the remnants of this black eye.
What was the biggest fight you had?
Well,
biggest disagreement?
The truth is we had no fights. I think the book project actually brought us closer together.
Everyone raised your hand if you believe that. They had no fights. Now, maybe it didn't mean you had to hit each other, but you had to have some serious disagreements.
No, we actually didn't. What was, I think, interesting about the project and the collaboration of the two brothers, when you think about it, is I grew up and worked as a journalist, so I'm coming out of the journalism world and a kind of investigative reporter approach to everything. And Bill, having spent his life as a scholar, is coming from a scholarly approach. And so I think this actually ended up complementing one another. So while I was saying things like, my God, these Jackie Kennedy letters are unbelievable. We're learning, that Robert McNamara and Jackie Kennedy had a very close relationship.
Every month.
Yeah, that's big.
He would go to New York to see.
Let me finish this. I said, that's big news, Bill. And Bill was impressed, but then Bill would say, but there are these interesting policy issues about the Cold War that we need to deal with. So I think it worked out beautifully.
So you did fight.
We didn't fight.
I mean, if he's kissing off the whole Jackie Kennedy...
He's not kissing it off. He's, look, I know it's hard to believe, but, it was very smooth. At any rate, you had a question about Jackie.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's pyrotechnic, isn't it?
Well,
what was it?
When I went to Diana McNamara, this project began.
His wife.
McNamara was married for many years to a woman named Margie, and they seemed totally devoted to her. And I think he was genuinely devoted to her. She died, and then he had a series of relationships with different women. Some of you may remember the affair he had with Joan Braden, who was a well-known Washingtonian, even though she was married at the time.
And tell him who she was married.
And her husband was Tom Braden.
And what was his job?
Tom was also a journalist. But they had what we refer to as an open marriage. So they, that was okay with Tom said. At any rate, Diana McNamara, gave us these letters. I looked at them and I said, holy smokes, did Robert McNamara have an affair with Jackie Kennedy? The answer is, we don't know. A physical affair, I mean. They clearly had a very close, loving relationship. It may have been platonic. We don't know. We have no evidence to show it was ever physical. But when you look at the book, you'll see the reference to dozens of these letters that she wrote him over the years. These are letters of a woman devoted to Robert McNamara, a woman who believes that he will end the war in Vietnam.
And there's a scene in which she's beating on his chest.
Yes.
Tell that.
Yeah. So picture this, okay? Robert McNamara, probably the most reviled figure in America at this time as defense secretary during the Vietnam War. He's going up to New York regularly. He told Bob he was going up to New York once a month to spend the evening with Jackie Kennedy. So on one of these occasions, I love this story, he's traveling without any any security detail, you know. He's probably recognizable across the country. Millions of people have been marching against Robert McNamara in the Vietnam War. He takes the shuttle, the airplane to New York. There's a taxi strike. So he's staying in Midtown by the East River. Jackie lives up on 85th Street and 5th Avenue. He gets on a bus in New York. There's a taxi strike. And as he claims no one recognized him, as he gets off the bus, he's jostled around. He steps onto the sidewalk and realizes he's been pickpocketed, okay? So now Robert McNamara is going to pick up Jackie Kennedy to take her to one of the most expensive French restaurants in New York, and he has not a penny on him. So he's sweating about what to do. They go to the restaurant, and he's thinking, my God, how am I going to handle this? He walks in the door, and who does he see in the corner? The president of the World Bank, Robert Wood, whom he knows. Jackie gets seated. He goes over, and he says, Bob, could you lend me a little money? But so, you know, this to me is an amazing story. But the story you alluded to, on another trip, he goes up. And Jackie gets very agitated. She became, you know, a very fierce opponent of the war. And so they're sitting on the sofa in her library on Fifth Avenue. And at a certain point, she goes over to Bob and starts pounding him on the chest and basically saying, stop the slaughter, Bob, stop the slaughter. And his answer to her, which is so revealing, is essentially, I wish I could, but I don't know how. Those are my words. The actual words are in the book, but that's the meaning of what he was saying.
So probably no one in the country can answer this question better than you. Do you think we're going to see the use of nuclear weapons in the near or medium-term future?
You know, I ended the work on my nuclear book, The Partnership, the book about Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, and Bill Perry, all former senior government officials who were trying to eliminate nuclear weapons. And I spent time reporting for that book, and I went to Poland, and I watched them transferring enriched uranium from Poland back to Russia, where it would be you know, turned into something less dangerous. When I wrote that book, I thought the chances of a nuclear exchange of some kind were on the increase. I still think so. But in an odd way, Donald Trump, whatever you think of him, and I'll keep most of my opinions to myself, he seems averse to getting engaged in some terrible conflict abroad.
Seems.
I use the word
But
seems.
then if you go a little deeper, seems with Trump means, you know, seems on Tuesday, but action on Wednesday might be different. George Kennan, really the author of the containment theory during the Cold War, used to refer to what happens to people who go in the Oval Office or go to advise or report to the president. And he says, I love this term, there is a treacherous curtain of deference. Other words, that no matter who it is coming into the President of the United States, and whatever the terms or the information, there is this treacherous curtain of deference that filters and often negates what's happening. Do you see that operating in the relationships that you write about so masterfully in your book?
Absolutely. Look, you and I have been in the Oval Office, you more than me, to interview presidents. And, you know, I think it's kind of cooked into our culture at this point, this sense that that is somehow a unique space where almost unlimited power is exercised by a single person. And so the first time I ever stepped into the Oval Office myself, I kind of stopped and looked around deliberately to kind of take it in, having read about it so much over the years.
There are many things interesting about the Oval Office, but one of them is the lighting. Right. Because there's no overhead lighting, so it's as if everything is perfectly lit. So it is a room, interestingly enough, without shadows.
Yes, I did not notice. That's interesting. So I think, you know, the aura of the Oval Office and the presidency and the aura of the presidency more than the office, when you go to Camp David, as McNamara did frequently, or George Shultz, all these people who are dealing at a very top level with presidents, they can't escape that aura. And there is that built-in deference, and I think an unwillingness, for the most part, to sit there or stand there and say, Mr. President, you are wrong. I don't think that happens very often.
And in the end, did it happen in a meaningful way for McNamara to Johnson?
Never.
Yeah,
it never happened with Johnson and McNamara. And McNamara, you know, he was so tormented, I think, by his failure to do that. There's a scene that Deborah wrote about beautifully in her book when you know, McNamara is leaving office and the president Johnson is presenting him, I think, with the Medal of Freedom to thank him for his service. And McNamara is so torn up by this point. He's kind of eaten alive by the dichotomies in him, the sense, as you said, of McNamara at war with himself. The medal is presented, and he stands there, I guess, in the White House, and he can't speak. He literally cannot speak, and he mumbles a few words and sits down. So, you know, this is his abiding failure, and the verdict of history, I don't think will ever change about Robert McNamara, is that he is the classic example of failed leadership.
And in one of the things I wrote about McNamara, about Vietnam, that Vietnam, the word kind of comes out of his mouth like a giant two-syllable spark. And I actually watched him and said this, and then he wipes his whole face with his hands, just like somehow he's trying to eradicate the memory or the responsibility. I mean, I witnessed this, and I thought, wow, this is a physical attempt at expiation of sin. Mm-hmm. Is that
exactly
overreading
I think
it?
Yes, exactly. And you know, he spent his last years, we devote a chapter in the book, unlike almost any other official that I've ever heard of in Washington in modern times, he spent the last decades of his life trying to understand the policy mistakes he made, not the personal character failures that he had. And there were a series of conferences that took place revisiting the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which he played an important role as Kennedy's defense secretary, and the Vietnam War. He went to Hanoi, he went to Havana, he went to Moscow. My brother, actually, I wish Bill were here, attended some of these meetings with McNamara. So at the meeting, one of the meetings in Havana, Fidel Castro was there. And they're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And near the end of the meeting, I think it may have been Castro who said to McNamara, well, Mr. McNamara, we'll do this again, you know, in the future, maybe 10 years from now, we'll have another conference trying to understand this. And by the way, the protagonist in these events, attended these conferences, not just Castro, but the Soviet leaders who had been heavily involved in the Cold War and so on. And McNamara looks at as he's about to leave the room, I think he turns around and he says, "In 10 years, I will be in hell."
You have to think he meant it.
I think he meant it.
I mean,
And listen, when he died, the last day of his life, and the story of Robert McNamara is also a terrible story of family rupture, because his wife opposed the war. His children, he had a son and 2 daughters, they opposed the war. And his son, who was the youngest of the siblings, Craig, who's an absolutely wonderful man I've gotten to know very well working on this book. He operates a walnut farm in the Central Valley of California. Craig opposed the war. He put a American flag, hung it upside down in his bedroom at home. His father saw that and said not a word about it to his son. So now fast forward to the end of McNamara's life, and Craig is there, next to him, and McNamara says to Craig, "Craigie," he called him Craigie, "God has abandoned me."
so now what about you? Because you look at your career, I mean, you're affiliated with the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford for 17 years.
Right.
Now, why don't you, like most academics, as I was suggesting earlier, go away and write these articles that no one ever reads? Instead, you come parachuting back into the belly of the beast. National security, decision making, and just in knowing your background and knowing you, it's not as if you're a pie in the sky guy. You were Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times. That's a learning experience in itself, right?
It sure was.
What'd you learn?
What did I learn in Moscow?
Yeah.
I learned what it's like to live in a totalitarian system, is what I learned. I wasn't directly affected by it. My colleague here, Serge Schmemann, was in the bureau, was bureau chief for the Times when I arrived. The experience of living in the Soviet Union in that era, Gorbachev had just taken office, so things were barely beginning to loosen up. Eventually, that all picked up speed. But at the beginning, it was astounding to discover that there were bugs planted in the walls of our apartments so that our conversations could be listened to.
Did it change your behavior?
We had 2 young boys at home at that time, and Felicity, my wife, we said to each other, "Look, we're under constant surveillance. We can't let that impact us. We just have to get on with our lives," and we did. But when you see a totalitarian system up close, let me tell you, it is truly horrifying. And let me just tell you one quick anecdote.
Please.
Okay? I got there. I had been there probably for just a week or 2 when I called an artist in Moscow named Grisha Brushkin. He had been producing art for years, had not been able to exhibit it anywhere because the Soviet authorities wouldn't let him. It was stacked up like cordwood in his apartment/studio. I made the fatal, stupid error of a kind of rookie reporter. Serge may remember this. I picked up the phone in the bureau, which I had been told never to do, probably by Serge, and called Grisha at his number. He answered. We agreed to meet. I met him in Pushkin Square. We talked for 15 or 20 minutes. He said, "Come over to my apartment. I'll show you my art." I went over, spent an hour talking to him. I stupidly said, "Would you come to dinner at our apartment?" Well, our apartment was, you couldn't even get in the front entrance without showing your ID to a Millie man. So this is really rookie stuff. I'm embarrassed even to talk about it now. So we go through all this. I go home, and an hour later, the phone rings, and it's Pushkin. And he says, Phil, 20 minutes after you left, there was a knock on my door. It was the KGB. They came to my apartment, and they said, Grisha, they never said a word about me. They never said a word that he had been interacting with an American correspondent. They said, Grisha, we know you were involved in a fatal automobile accident, so you better behave yourself. There had been no fatal automobile accident. That's what life was like in the Soviet Union.
Okay, now if, all of them, and having read the book and knowing you, and I don't care about what your politics may be, but nothing comes clamoring through that you have political point of view. Suppose Donald Trump had an advisor who would say, you need to know more about Russia and the Soviet Union and the press. Call Phil Taubman in and have an hour lunch with him. No, I mean, this is serious. Look, I've written a lot about Trump. I know, have my differences and have stated them. But he has the capacity occasionally to listen. What would you say to him?
Well, I'm not an expert on Putin. I worked in Moscow while Gorbachev was the Soviet leader. But what I would say, and I think it's clear to anybody who knows anything about Russian history, it was 1,000 years of tyranny. There is no democratic history in Russia. There was a glimmer of hope under Gorbachev and then under the erratic rule of Boris Yeltsin. But Putin has essentially restored the old regime. It looks different. A lot of people are making money now. There's a kind of glitter to some aspects of the rich in Russia that didn't exist in our day. But I think if you're dealing with Putin and you're talking about Ukraine, you have to understand that Vladimir Putin essentially wants to restore the Soviet Empire. He essentially believes that Ukraine is part of Russia.
And not just a little bit. He has actually argued in a manifesto 4 years ago, Putin very directly saying that this affiliation between Russia and Ukraine goes back to the 9th century. Now, that's a long time ago.
Yeah, and in some ways it does, religiously and culturally and historically. There is an affinity, absolutely. But what I think Trump fails to understand, and I think it was evident.
You're talking to him now. You can say, "What, Mr.
Yeah.
President, what you might not understand."
What you should understand is that you may think you have a good relationship with Vladimir Putin personally. You may think that because of that, he is going to end the war in Ukraine. I'm telling you, that is dead wrong. That personal diplomacy counts for nothing with Vladimir Putin. He is determined to conquer Ukraine.
Okay, so Trump's going to ask you, do you think if Putin was pinched in, really facing a catastrophe, what the Russians call a catastrophic battlefield loss, that he might use a tactical nuclear weapon? Because that has to be a worry that Trump has.
I think it was a worry that Biden had. I'm sure it's a thought that Trump has
And
had.
how close?
We don't know. These
That's not the answer that is useful to a president.
but-
Hey, he already doesn't know because he's asked you.
But that's
what do you think?
That's why I've never been a presidential advisor. So, this is part of being the job of president of the United States. You have to assess these risks. You have to keep them in mind.
To know, you have the, this is if Russia at any point, for any reason, resorts to using tactical nuclear weapons, we live in a different world,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so he's asking a simple question. Yes, it's complicated, but an important one that maybe you, even as a journalist, want to put him on the path to getting the best possible answer.
So, Bob, I'm going to do something impolite, if you don't mind. Let's go back and talk about McNamara rather than Putin.
Okay. I'm sorry. That's
We have to watch the clock.
okay. Yes, we're almost done. We'll have questions from the audience. But what would McNamara say?
I'm not going to speculate.
No, but you could give a sound answer.
I don't think it's going to lead us into a fruitful conversation. I'm sorry.
Okay. Fair enough. Questions from the audience, please. Line up here.
So I'm over here. So you and I are about the same age. I started Yale Law School in September 1969. I met my late husband. He was 2 years ahead of me, class of 70. His class started the usual 160 people, including 8 women, and finished 90 men on time. Everything else was the war. Everybody in my class who hadn't already served was 1A. We had 500,000 men in Vietnam. The place, we had, well, the mobilization, the moratorium. There's no sympathy. My question is, you're about the same age as I am. What did you do during the war?
During the war, I got a medical deferment, so I did not serve. If my brother did not serve either, he got a deferment in the post-Sputnik era because scholars studying the Soviet Union were considered to be in the national interest of the United States to develop Soviet experts. So neither of us served in Vietnam.
Did you join the
What was
anti-war
the
movement?
medical deferment for?
For me,
Yes.
oddly enough, given that my brother just got back surgery, I had a back problem.
I see. Did you ever feel it's kind of unfair? Some people serve and some don't.
Absolutely. And especially in that era, you know, today it's a volunteer army. In my era, your era, it was a draft.
Right.
You know, the draft, those of you who remember that era will know that the draft was an incredibly powerful force in American society because all the men of draft age knew that their draft notice could come and that they could wind up in Vietnam.
Right.
And that was one of the things that I think fueled the anti-war movement.
Absolutely.
Next question now, please, sir.
Thank you so much to both of you for being here today. My name is Nathan, and I'm a recent college graduate from here in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm hoping ultimately to teach American history, and that's something I've been passionate about for a long time. My question is, I listened with interest to you talking about your time in Moscow, and I was curious what your memories are of the Soviet Jewish refusnik movement, and if you had the opportunity to meet or interact with any refusniks.
Many. They were among the few people in the Soviet Union who felt they could talk to an American reporter because they had already been ostracized by the society, partly because they were Jewish and partly because many of the Jews in the Soviet Union had asked to emigrate. And you couldn't, it's not like the United States where if you're an American citizen, you go to the airport and if you got a passport, you get on a plane and go anywhere you want. In the Soviet Union, you couldn't get on an airplane to go anywhere without the permission of the government. You had to have, in effect, a departure visa to leave. So the refusniks, the dissidents who were Jewish, we befriended them, they befriended us. We made many friends among that community. Many of them did eventually emigrate under Gorbachev and live here in the United States. that was part of the power, I think, of working in the Soviet Union. All the relationships that one had there were magnified because of the intensity of the situation. Thank you for your question.
You write and quote that he really wanted to bring the boys home.
Hold it.
I'm sorry. You write and quote that he really wanted to bring the boys home, and he did. He brought them home in coffins. He brought them home with PTSD. He brought them home as alcoholics and drug addicts, spouse abusers. He brought them home to suicide. He's also directly responsible for 2.5 million deaths of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians. He bombed their hospitals, their clinics, their schools, their rice fields. We are in the 4th generation of dioxin poisoning, which has deformed a lot of people. So to call it failed leadership, I think, is a little too antiseptic. These are war crimes. And as Nuremberg proved, just because you follow the leader above you doesn't get you off. He should have been jailed and put in a cage, yeah.
So, McNamara thought of himself as a war criminal. There is a point in his interviews with Errol Morris for the documentary Fog of War, in which he says, Curtis LeMay, who planned the firebombing of Tokyo and led the squadrons that executed that, McNamara actually advised LeMay, came up with a strategy, helped to contribute to a strategy for those attacks, the vectors. And so in that interview with those interviews, McNamara said, if we'd lost the war, Curtis LeMay and I would have been convicted as war criminals.
Is that in your book?
Sorry.
Is that in your book, that part?
Yes, that's in the book.
Hello, my name is Anand. I have a question, which is, I think in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, there was just one official who was always against the war. That was George Ball, the Undersecretary of State. And why was it that he was not able to make his voice heard? And did McNamara kind of, when they were in cabinet meetings with Johnson, did he put down Ball's point of view?
So George Ball's a fascinating figure. As the questioner said, he was the dissenter in the Johnson administration on Vietnam. He's the Undersecretary of State, a very senior official. And it's very curious how Robert McNamara dealt with him. In his own papers, Ball talks about the fact that before he and McNamara would go to the White House for meetings on Vietnam, McNamara would go to the State Department, meet with Ball in his office, and agree with everything that George Ball was saying about how going into war in Vietnam was a huge mistake and that we couldn't prevail and that we should get out. And then they'd go to the White House and he'd sit at McNamara in the Oval Office and he'd shoot down absolutely everything that George Ball said.
Thank you.
Explain that.
Hi, Deborah Shapley. Nice to meet you. How are you?
I've never met
Thank you.
Deborah.
I've never met you.
We've talked,
I've
and my
met-
brother
okay.
came to spend time with her,
Thank you.
and one of our wonderful research assistants, Courtney Douglas, spent several days going through
Yeah,
your
thank
archives.
you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I can't wait to read this work building on everything that went before. But at the risk of being a journalist, I might ask an unpopular question.
Sure.
In the debates after that, and probably in those meetings with the president as well that you just referenced, the case was always made that the enemy, that South Vietnam was corrupt and fragile. So if we pulled out, it would fall, right? So when I was speaking with McNamara, I'm sure I quoted it, if we're the Secretary of Defense of the United States to quit, it would encourage the enemy and the collapse. So I'm sure you deal with this idea, and I do think the debates should be also consider what were the actual foreign policy implications of a U.S. withdrawal. It's not just a question of what was right and wrong from our point of view here. So have you got any really news about whether they thought about a collapse and how they would deal with the fallout, literally, from China and Russia, which were unknowns? I mean, it seems that's encouraging the enemy is just not is not probably a good idea from some points of view.
So, this you're alluding, of course, to the very widespread, ubiquitous view in Washington at that era that the communist menace would advance, that if South Vietnam fell, Southeast Asia would fall.
But I'm not asking about the dominoes. I'm just asking about the fact that they knew that the South Vietnam government couldn't survive if we left.
I think they kept trying to convince themselves that they could deal with the Vietnamese government, as bad as it was. That, to me, was one of the illusions that they had. That they kept pouring American resources and manpower into Vietnam, understanding, they were not naive about that, understanding that the foundation for all of this, the South Vietnamese government, was corrupt and unpopular. So I'm sorry, we need to
But I'm
let
just
other
asking
people
if
ask.
they planned for a collapse. In other words,
I don't, the book doesn't get into that aspect of it. Thanks for your help, by the way.
Thank you. I am a big. My name is Daniel. I am a big fan of Khrushchev and Gorbachev biographies by Will. So my question to you is, like having studied and observed decision making on both sides of Iron Curtain, what you think is the most similar in terms of how decisions were made during the Cold War, and what is the most different?
So wait, I'm not sure I understand your question.
Now there is a book on McNamara, and your brother is of course famous on with his books about Khrushchev and Gorbachev. So in terms of decision making, how decisions were made here and how decisions were made in Moscow, what's the most similar and what's the most different?
Well, I think I shouldn't answer that question. My brother should. He's the expert on how decisions were made in the Kremlin. I think that what I would say is that as the decisions made in the Kremlin, about which Bill wrote these two wonderful books, and the decisions made in the Oval Office that I wrote about as a journalist and write about in my books. The problem is when decisions are made without full debate, when decisions are made without adequate information about the place in which you're intervening. I think it's a tricky comparison because the operations of the Kremlin, the Politburo, the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Let me just stop there, and if you would leave your name here, I will get Bill to send you an email answering your question, okay?
May I try one last question? And that is...
We want to get Serge.
Okay, yes, sir, you go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, it's great to see you here again. Last time I saw you was right here discussing your last book. We barely got through that, and now this whole new, incredibly momentous book. So I hope you give us a couple of years before the next one so we can
there won't be
digest
another book anytime soon.
You'd think he's 37 years old the way
I
he
know exactly
keeps
how old
turning
he
it
is.
out.
He's a child. He's not even 80 yet. I was actually going to follow up on Deborah's question. That's the same one I had.
Get a little closer.
Yeah, I was going to follow up Deborah's question, because when you say that the problem was a failure of leadership, and then you describe that conversation with Jackie, in which McNamara says, I really didn't know. I don't know how to end it. Is that necessarily a failure of leadership? He knows he wants to end the war. He really doesn't know how. Because maybe ending it has repercussions that he has to take into account. The question is then, in his subsequent sort of soul searching, did he ever consider how he might have done it, how it might have been possible, what opportunity he missed to end it?
Thank you, Serge. He ruminated a lot, and he talked about it in his book. What were the off-ramps for Vietnam? And there were a number of diplomatic initiatives that unfurled during those years. I alluded to the one with the two Frenchmen and Henry Kissinger. The Poland got involved at one point in trying to encourage some kind of diplomatic discussions. There were other efforts. And McNamara did try to encourage those. You know, Averell Harriman, the name many of you will remember, he was the designated negotiator for peace, you know, if there were to be negotiations. And McNamara spent a lot of time, you can see this in the McNaughton diary, spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to encourage these initiatives. What he thought would happen in Vietnam if we left, you can see in the discussions that were going on with McNaughton, they talked about creating some kind of system where there would remain a non-combatant American presence in Vietnam, but it all rested on the hope, which was really unrealistic, that Ho Chi Minh would accept some kind of deal to end the war that did not surrender the independence of South Vietnam. And that was a deal that Ho Chi Minh would never have made, I think. And because of the Johnson attitude, and then of course, you know, we saw what happened with Nixon and Kissinger later, you know, like Putin today in Ukraine, I think Ho Chi Minh sat there and Hanoi said, we'll wait them out, and eventually we will win.
Just, may I ask you one last question?
Yes, of course.
We're out of town. And what is the most important experience in your life that really had an impact on you that maybe people should know about to understand you as the presenter of what I label a masterpiece?
Well, well, that's an interesting question. I think about it. I would say that when I look back on my life, the most important time, I'm not going to go back and do a McNamara self, you know, examination of my entire life and my childhood and so on, but professionally, let's just deal with my journalism career. It was the time in the Soviet Union, okay? You know, I did stories here in Washington that exposed the covert operations of the Reagan administration in Central America. They created a big stir, big headlines in the New York Times. You know, that was important to me. I wrote a lot about people affected by the policies of the American government, but I think without a doubt, the cauldron, the crucible that shaped my lasting attitudes as a reporter and a journalist, as a writer, were the years in Moscow. Because, as I said earlier, you are dealing with people at such a level of intensity that when they meet you in the public square, they are confronted, as I said, by the KGB within 30 minutes. You're dealing with people who, when they deal with an American reporter, are sent to involuntarily to a psychiatric institution. You are dealing with a society where we have a photograph taken by a gentleman that Serge knew well of one of these people in a psychiatric institution somewhere in Moscow, I guess, and he's in a prison-like room, and all you can see in the photograph is the cell door with a little slit in it that's about 6 inches across and 3 inches high. And all you can see in this photograph is that gentleman's eyes looking out at the photographer. When you see stuff like that, you can't help but be changed.
And of course, this comes from the probably one of the first rules of journalism, and that is go to the scene.
Yeah.
Go to the scene.
Go to the scene.
I remember as a young reporter not going to the scene once, and the editor said, "Get your ass out of the chair and go to the scene. It's 2 effing blocks away."
Exactly. Yep.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's so good, it may be I think it may be the last book on McNamara.
Well, thank you, Bob. I really appreciate your taking the time off to come up here today. I've competed against him as a journalist. He's always prevailed. But he's a true gentleman to come out and help support my book project.
And copies of the book are available at the checkout desk, and Phil will be up here happy to sign your copy.